October 1943. A gray dawn drags over the flooded fields on the outskirts of Hamburg. Thick fog swallows the hangars, and the wind carries a mixed scent of burned oil, fuel, and wet wood, an aroma that heralds destruction and discovery. Inside an isolated shed, Luftwaffe engineers crowd around a structure suspended by cables. Under the cold light of industrial lamps rests a nearly intact British aircraft, captured after a forced landing, the de Havilland Mosquito B Mk4 Series II. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, a middle-aged aeronautical engineer, adjusts his glasses as he observes in silence. He had worked on metal fighter projects, the Heinkel 111, the Focke-Wulf 190, and believed he mastered the secret of efficient flight. But before him, nothing made sense. The plane's surface seemed alive. When a blade touches the coating, there is no familiar metallic sound, but an organic crack, dry, like wood under tension. The echo travels through the hangar, intriguing everyone. An assistant approaches with a lantern and, hesitantly, runs his fingers along the inner edge of the panel. The texture is smooth, warm, and the scent, sweet, resinous, reminds him of furniture varnish, not the smell of war. "Her doctor," the young man murmurs. "This is wood?" The silence that follows is almost religious. The confirmation hangs in the air like an insult and a mystery. The laughter comes soon after, nervous, disguised. "A wooden bomber? The English must have run out of aluminum." The sound of mockery echoes off the iron walls, but it doesn't last long. A technician tries to pry off a section of the fuselage with a precision blade. The tip bends. He insists. The layer splits, but the glue doesn't give. Another engineer grabs a chisel, hammers, forces the joint. The result is the same. The wood breaks before the connection loosens. The noise of frustration mixes with the hum of test engines outside. The joke dies there. Henkel, curious, requests a sample. He holds the fragment up to the light and sees something hypnotic. Thin layers, alternating shades of ivory and amber. He measures the thickness with calipers, makes notes. The weight is nearly half that of aluminum, and the rigidity, unexpected. Wood light on the inside, dense on the outside. When he touches the edge, he feels the solidity vibrate, as if there were accumulated force between the fibers. The engineer understands that he is not facing improvisation, but calculation. The fuselage flows curve like violin lines, not tank ones. Each joint is invisible. Each transition seems hand-molded. While the Germans build machines that challenge the air with force, the British seem to seduce it with grace. Henkel walks around the Mosquito, and as the light filters through the hangar, the varnish's sheen creates golden reflections on the wet floor. He feels something he doesn't understand: respect. That aircraft wasn't assembled, it was sculpted. An assistant brings the report recovered from the wreckage. The engineer reads it slowly. Top speed, 640 kilometers per hour. Total weight, half of a Heinkel 111. Crew, 2 men. Range, superior to many escort fighters. And a detail that makes him furrow his brow: no defensive armament. The bomber flew unarmed, relying solely on its speed. Henkel looks up. Outside, the sky vibrates with the distant sound of Allied engines. For years, that sound meant German air dominance. Now, it was a reminder that something was changing. He touches the fuselage again. The surface is so smooth it reflects the outline of his face. No rivets, no welds, just continuity. They didn't build an airplane, they built an idea, he thinks. Henkel asks to examine the interior. The technicians remove the front panel. Inside, cables and simple, compact, practical instruments. None of the typical German redundancy. Everything seems optimized for a single function: speed. He closes the notebook and takes a deep breath. Lightness has become armor. The noise of a part falling breaks the silence. One of the young engineers, still incredulous, whispers, "How did they manage this?" No one answers. Outside, the sun begins to rise, filtering through the fog. The hangar seems like a cathedral, and the Mosquito, a psalter. The portrait of Goering on the wall watches the scene with a mute gaze. Below him, the engineers realize something they dare not admit. The enemy is not foolish, he is innovative. Hankel notes in his preliminary report, composite fuselage, uniform gluing, absence of mechanical fasteners, reduced weight, exceptional resistance. Then he writes a sentence in an almost inaudible voice. The glue is stronger than steel. A chill runs through the group. That wasn't a metaphor. It was literal. That morning, Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel understands that the greatest insult is not in the fact that the enemy uses wood, but in the fact that they made it work. He knows that that furniture airplane carries an uncomfortable meaning. While the Reich designs steel monsters, the British manufacture instruments that defy the logic of war. The wind crosses the gaps in the shed, and the sound seems like a whisper. Hankel lifts his eyes to the ceiling and for a moment imagines the Mosquito in flight, light, fast, impossible to catch. The scent of resin and wood dust invades his senses. The enemy smells like a workshop, not war. And it is in that contrast that he perceives the true terror. The war is changing shape. It no longer belongs to tanks and rivets, but to ideas. As the October sun reflects off the Mosquito's golden hull, Hankel closes the notebook and thinks, in a premonition that will haunt him for years, if they can build this, what else are they hiding? The hangar remains silent. The glue dries, the fear hardens, and the wooden airplane sleeps, awaiting to become the Luftwaffe's nightmare. The captured Mosquito was secretly taken to the Rechlin testing center, the Luftwaffe's technical brain under Karl Kiesling's supervision. There, enemy aircraft were opened like military necropsies, measured, photographed, reduced to numbers. But no plane had provoked as much silence as that British wooden bomber that the English called the Wooden Wonder. Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel walked between metal benches, hearing his own footsteps on the cold concrete, and watched the teams remove panels mark by mark, as if disassembling a musical instrument instead of a weapon of war. The scent in the air was already strange, not the acidic smell of cut aluminum, but sweet resin, fine sawdust, and hot glue. It seemed like a violin workshop, not a front line. For days, precision saws and thin blades opened the fuselage like flipping through a secret. The first revelation that wounded German pride didn't come from the wood, but from the engines. 2 Rolls-Royce Merlins, still beautiful even covered in dry mud, were mounted almost surgically. The fuel lines ran clean, rational, without the redundant tube labyrinth common in German designs. Hankel's assistant did the math in a low voice. 2 Merlins, about 1,460 horsepower each, nearly 3,000 horsepower total, pushing a bomber that weighed less than many German twin-engine fighters. He repeated the number as if it were too absurd to exist. Hankel didn't respond. He just noted the power-to-weight ratio and while writing realized that alone was a direct insult to the Reich's doctrine. But the real blow was in the plane's skin. When they removed a fuselage segment, they expected to see internal aluminum ribs and screwed plates. Instead, they found 2 halves molded in pressed plywood, glued under pressure, and then joined like violin shells. There were no rows of rivets, no apparent seams. From afar, the hull looked like a single piece, curved, uninterrupted, designed to slip through the air. A technician tried to separate the joint by applying heat and mechanical force. The wood broke first. The room froze. It was officially easier to destroy the material than to defeat the glue. The joke of the little furniture airplane died that hour, and no one laughed again. Hankel brought his face close to the fracture and studied it with a magnifying glass. The cut showed a sandwich of alternating layers of birch and balsa, impregnated with phenol formaldehyde resin. The birch provided structural rigidity. The balsa ensured almost absurd lightness. The glue had penetrated the fibers so deeply that it seemed part of the wood itself. He noted composite structure, high specific resistance, density lower than aluminum. He wrote the word composite slowly. In German doctrine, strength meant metal, armor meant respect. Weight meant authority, and suddenly the British were winning with something that looked like living room furniture. That wasn't just engineering, It was ideological humiliation wrapped in shiny varnish. The bench tests confirmed the heresy. When they pulled the samples under tension, the structure didn't break dryly like a fatigued metal plate. It bent, absorbed load, distributed vibration like a recurve bow absorbs impact. That explained how the Mosquito could dive at absurd speeds, attack low, and pull back intact. It also explained why it was so hard to shoot down with anti-aircraft fire. It was like trying to hit a light, nervous animal that never flew straight long enough. Nothing in it was waste. Everything in it was function. They also evaluated the aircraft's nose. No excess. No redundancy to please inspectors. Essential instruments, light, placed where pilot and navigator could operate like two hands of the same body. The Mosquito flew high-precision missions with just 2 crew members. German medium bombers required 5, 7, even 10 men. Fewer people meant less oxygen, less space, less inert weight. Every kilogram saved returned as speed. Then came the performance numbers, and the room grew cold. Measured top speed, approximately 640 kilometers per hour. Climb rate, twin-engine fighter level. Payload capacity, 2 tons of bombs. Defensive armament, none. No rear machine gun, no dorsal blister, nothing. The only defense was not to be caught. A veteran engineer murmured that it was suicide. Honkel replied, "Lo, it's not suicide, it's mathematics." The phrase hung in the air like a condemnation, and no one retorted. Operational reports from the front arrived and were even worse for German pride. The Mosquito was appearing in broad daylight over Berlin, Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Oslo. It entered low, hit Gestapo barracks, radios, depots, and vanished. Point defense fighters took off and failed due to pure speed and acceleration difference. Anti-aircraft batteries could barely lock on before the target had passed. There were records of entire missions without losses. For the Luftwaffe, that wasn't just a fast airplane, it was a psychological message. You no longer control the sky. And then came the realization no one wanted to put in an official report. The Luftwaffe could study the Mosquito, but it couldn't copy it. The phenolic resin required chemical reagents that the Reich already diverted to explosives. Germany's large factories depended on strategic aluminum and centralized assembly lines, easy to bomb. Britain, meanwhile, had spread production among carpenters, luthiers, furniture workshops, and small civilian firms. If one facility fell, the flow didn't stop. It was distributed war against rigid industry, adaptation against pride. At the end of that week of technical autopsy, Honkel was alone in the hangar. The half-disassembled fuselage hung under yellow light. The polished wood returned warm, almost organic reflections, different from the cold, arrogant shine of German aeronautical aluminum. The distant noise of saws seemed like a clock marking the end of an era. He ran his hand over the surface and felt warmth, not ice. And there he accepted the verdict no one in Berlin would dare pronounce aloud. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing airplanes, it was losing the future. Now. Winter advanced over Rechlin as the Mosquito was fully disassembled. The parts spread across the hangar like bones of an animal that defied logic. Each component, from the smallest engine screw to the propeller blades, seemed to hide a lesson in humility. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel studied the accumulated reports on his desk, and each number sounded like a bitter confession. The British airplane wasn't just an anomaly, it was a materialized philosophy. He realized he was no longer disassembling a machine, but an idea, that force and order would be enough to defeat the enemy's ingenuity and improvisation. In the reports, the data spoke for itself. Top speed, 640 kilometers per hour. Range, 2,000 kilometers. Production cost half of a medium German bomber. But the note that disturbed him most came from interceptions. German night fighters, even the most modern ones, couldn't keep up with it. The Mosquito simply disappeared from radar, flying so fast and so low that it seemed like a shadow refusing to be captured. It was invisible through simplicity. War, Henkel was beginning to understand, was no longer a confrontation of forces, but of mindsets. He began comparing doctrines. On one side, the Reich and its hierarchical bureaucratic engineering, obsessed with perfection, where every error was punished and every improvisation seen as weakness. On the other, Britain, practical, adaptable, driven by the urgency of survival. While the Germans built aerial fortresses, the British created instruments of escape. The Mosquito was the product of a nation that had traded arrogance for ingenuity. Germany designed flying tanks, England, war violins, and the sound those violins produced now echoed through the occupied European skies. Hankel picked up a sheet of notes and scribbled the phrase he had found in a captured enemy report. Speed is the best armor. Simple, insolent, perfect. In one line, the British had condensed the doctrine the Luftwaffe would take years to understand. Every rivet the Germans added for safety was a gram less of freedom. Every layer of steel they used to protect their pilots made their planes a little slower, more predictable, more vulnerable. And while the Reich bet on force, the English bet on lightness. Weight was winning the wrong war. The news spread through the laboratories. New radar units reported Mosquito attacks in broad daylight. They crossed northern France, dropped bombs, and vanished before anyone could react. A squadron commander described the frustration of seeing the blip on radar move too fast and then disappear like a ghost. The Luftwaffe tried adapting its night fighters to intercept them, but none could climb fast enough. It was like trying to capture a thought. The little wooden airplane had become a steel nightmare. In Rechlin's corridors, nicknames began to circulate. Some officers called it Der Teufel aus Holz, the wooden devil. Hankel, however, didn't see it as a devil. He saw it as a symbol, a reminder that the enemy had won in what the regime despised most: imagination. The Mosquito wasn't designed by soldiers, but by artists, by carpenters, luthiers, piano makers. Workshops that once made furniture now produced wings. Civilian women applied glue over molds. Carpenters adjusted millimeter precision curves. And the result was an aircraft that defied the Reich's entire industrial logic. It was an insult to Nazi grandeur. While Hitler invested millions in superweapons promising total victory, England bet on the sum of small workshops and free minds. While the Luftwaffe depended on centralized, vulnerable factories, the British distributed the work across hundreds of small ateliers. Each piece of the Mosquito was born in a different corner of the country and united like a symphony. When German bombers destroyed one factory, 10 others continued producing. It was the collapse of rigidity before creative decentralization, an authoritarian system trying to defeat a democratic idea. Hankel knew this truth would never reach Berlin. If he said the enemy had won through freedom of thought, he would be accused of defeatism. So, he kept silent. He watched the disassembled Merlin engines, the yellowish gleam of the wooden wings under the cold light, and perceived the cruelest contrast. The Reich had built machines to inspire fear, and the British created one to inspire efficiency. He understood, with a knot in his chest, that lightness wasn't fragility. It was the future. The excessive weight of steel didn't just drag airplanes, it dragged ideas too. One day, at the end of the tests, Hankel remained alone in the laboratory. The drafting tables were covered in reports, and the sound of wind battering the windows seemed like a countdown clock. He walked to the disassembled fuselage, ran his hand over the golden varnish, and murmured something no one would hear. Perhaps this is the true strength. Outside, snow began to fall over Rechlin, slowly covering the debris of an empire that still believed weight was synonymous with power. And in the hangar's silence, the Mosquito slept, light, invincible, awaiting the history that would confirm its silent revenge. The winter of 1943 arrived at Rechlin like a mirror of the war itself, cold, relentless, and full of silences no one dared fill. The Mosquito, or what remained of it, lay disassembled on the benches, covered by tarps that couldn't hide the smell of phenolic glue and dry wood. The engineers had already extracted everything they could, weight, structure, performance, But what they couldn't decipher was what really made that airplane work, the mindset that created it. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel now seemed more philosopher than engineer. The formulas before him explained flight, but not the audacity. He saw in the numbers a provocation. The British were winning not through force, but through imagination. Germany still believed in scale, control, perfection. Every project needed superior signatures. Every technical decision passed through commissions that judged aesthetics before efficiency. England, suffocated by bombings and rationing, had no such luxury. There, error was just part of the path. Civilian workshops produced parts in secret, using concrete molds, improvised dryers, and sawdust from furniture factories. And yet from those workshops emerged machines capable of humiliating the Reich's steel pride. The Mosquito was more than a bomber. It was the triumph of decentralized thinking over the dictatorship of form. Henkel read and reread field reports. In Oslo, a Gestapo barracks had been destroyed by a formation of mosquitoes that arrived, attacked, and vanished before radars could adjust aim. In Copenhagen, another daytime raid had demolished an administrative building without missing a single target. German anti-aircraft defenses fired into the void. The Luftwaffe, which had prided itself on dominating European skies, now watched the enemy stroll unpunished over its own cities. What disturbed him most was the absence of heroism in those missions. No dramatic bravery, just efficiency. As if the Mosquito didn't even wage war, it merely fulfilled a purpose. One morning, a major brought new orders from Berlin. Present practical results. Henkel knew what that meant. Reproduce the German Mosquito. They gave it a sarcastic nickname, Muke, the little mosquito. He and his team tried. They replaced birch with beech, balsa with light pine, phenolic glue with casein and rubber-based adhesives. They made molds, tested pressures, and for a few weeks believed it was possible, until test flight day. Henkel watched the film in Rechlin's frozen auditorium. The prototype taking off, climbing steadily, and then in seconds, the right wing rippling like fabric before snapping in midair. The screen shook, the plane turned to smoke, and the room fell silent. He didn't need a report. He knew what it meant. The Germans couldn't copy an idea born of freedom. A few days later, Henkel was summoned to Berlin to present a summary to the high technical command. The room was full of officers in uniform with impatient stares. He displayed his charts, spoke of aerodynamics, weight, and rigidity. No one seemed to truly listen until a colonel interrupted. "So, you're saying the English won with wood?" Henkel hesitated. "I'm saying they turned scarcity into advantage." "Propaganda tricks," another replied dryly. "The Führer believes in steel, and steel is the future." Henkel lowered his gaze. There was no room for metaphors in those walls. And yet, deep down, he knew that was exactly what defeated him, the inability to understand the metaphor. Back in Rechlin, he wrote a personal report he would never send. In it, he recorded, "The enemy won in the invisible, won in the courage to improvise. We in the rigidity of repetition." In every line he confessed what no official speech would admit, that German failure wasn't engineering, but mindset. While Britain encouraged absurd ideas and tested the impossible, the Reich punished any deviation. And so the war ceased to be between countries and became between ways of thinking. The Mosquito was merely its messenger. The following weeks brought more reports, each more humiliating than the last. Mosquitoes flying over Berlin in broad daylight, dropping symbolic bombs on government buildings. Others hitting Gestapo bases with surgical precision. It was as if the airplane said, "Even your fear isn't safe." In the hangars, officers tried to hide the results, but the rumors spread. Among the engineers, no one laughed anymore. They knew that wooden airplane had already won without firing a single shot directly at the Luftwaffe. Its victory lay in the impossibility of being stopped. One night, Henkel returned alone to the hangar. The Mosquito's fuselage, now disassembled and without purpose, rested under months of dust. He lifted the tarp and felt the familiar resin scent. He touched the smooth hull and murmured, "It's not the material that wins, it's the mind that shapes it." Outside, the wind whistled through the gaps, carrying the distant sound of anti-aircraft sirens. Berlin was being bombed again. Perhaps, he thought, by other mosquitoes. There was a bitter irony in that. The airplane he had tried to understand now destroyed the very empire that surrounded it. When the order to dismantle the project arrived, a direct command from Berlin, he wasn't surprised. The mosquito had become an inconvenient symbol. It didn't serve the narrative of Germanic superiority. It was a reminder that intelligence and lightness could defeat force and pride. On the last night he was in that hangar, Henkel closed the notebook and wrote one final line. Modern war no longer belongs to those who master metal, but to those who master imagination. Then he turned off the lights and let the wind sound complete the sentence no one would dare read aloud. The war ended in 1945, but the mosquito's echo continued flying. The ground where Rechlin's testing center stood turned to ruins. The walls that once housed calculations, voices, and arrogance were now just cracked concrete and rust. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel walked among the debris with the same notebook he had carried throughout the war. The yellowed pages held notes from a time when logic seemed sufficient to win, but the war had proven otherwise. It wasn't steel that determined the future, but lightness, the ability to improvise when the impossible seemed inevitable. The mosquito, made of wood and stubbornness, had become the epitaph of an era that confused force with wisdom. In the following months, the British occupied Rechlin's laboratory. Part of the German team was invited, or forced, to collaborate. Henkel, among them, was taken into custody and transferred to England. There, for the first time, he saw the enemy's cradle, a de Havilland factory where hundreds of civilian workers assembled plywood fuselages with the same care a craftsman assembles an instrument. The environment lacked the metallic clang of German factories. No hammering, no shouts. There was music, literally. A radio played softly between the benches, while women applied glue with brushes and men sanded curved surfaces. The familiar scent of resin and varnish hit him hard. It was the same smell that had permeated Rechlin, only here there was no guilt in it. A British engineer accompanied him, explaining the process without arrogance. He spoke of birch layers, mold pressure, exact drying, with the glow of someone who loves what he creates. Henkel listened and realized that man wasn't talking about a weapon. He was talking about a masterpiece. He finally understood what he could never write in reports. The mosquito's secret wasn't technical, it was cultural. Germany had built machines for the state. England built machines to survive. German knowledge belonged to command, the British to hands. Here, power didn't come from fear, but from cooperation. As the women lifted wooden molds for drying, Henkel saw in them something that didn't exist in Reich factories: humanity. The mosquito was born of ordinary people, carpenters, luthiers, artists, and carried that in its soul. That's why its fuselage seemed alive, why it vibrated in flight like a tuned string. The German engineer looked around and realized none of it was designed to destroy, but to function. British efficiency wasn't cold, it was organic. The enemy had won because it believed in something the Reich would never understand: beauty as a tool of war. At night, in his quarters, Henkel opened the notebook and wrote, "They won because they believed in the invisible, because they dared to think light when everyone thought heavy, because they created together, not under orders, but under purpose." He closed the notebook and smiled for the first time in years. In that moment, he understood that the mosquito wasn't an insult. It was a lesson, a reminder that when the mind is free, even wood can challenge steel. The war had been history's greatest laboratory, and the mosquito its most elegant experiment. In the following years, when the reports became public, the whole world discovered the feat's magnitude. Over 7,700 mosquitoes had been built in 400 different versions: reconnaissance, bombing, fighter, night attack. Its survival rate was 4 times higher than heavy bombers. No metal aircraft in the entire war achieved such consistent results with so few resources. The wooden airplane had defeated the empire that swore it had mastered steel, and, ironically, its techniques gave birth to the future: fiberglass, epoxy, carbon fiber. The Mosquito didn't just survive the war, it founded the era of modern composites. Henkel never returned to Nazi Germany. He worked as a consultant in lightweight materials research and later dedicated himself to teaching. When asked which invention had marked him most, he replied without hesitation, "A bomber that flew like a violin." Many laughed, thinking it was a figure of speech, but he was serious, because the Mosquito hadn't been made to win through force, but through harmony, and that's what made it invincible. For Henkel, that airplane was the portrait of engineering freed from fear, a reminder that even war can reveal the power of human imagination. Years later, he visited an aviation museum where a restored Mosquito was on display. He touched the golden fuselage under the varnish, felt the same ancient scent of birch and resin, and closed his eyes. In silence, he heard the Merlin engine's sound echoing in his memory, a sound that wasn't of war, but of invention. He remembered the initial laughter in the Hamburg hangar, the broken blades, the mockery that ended in awe, and he smiled tenderly, because now he knew the true triumph of that airplane was moral, to prove that intelligence could be more lethal than fear. In his last note, he wrote something simple, almost a prayer. They built a bomber that didn't need to fight, and in doing so, they proved that imagination is the most silent weapon of all. Decades later, the Mosquito would still be called the Wooden Wonder, but for Henkel, it was more than a wooden marvel. It was the sound of an idea that defeated arrogance, weight, and war, flying light, fast, and impossible to stop.